Hello everyone, I'm Izzy McPhail from Rural Health and Wellbeing. This is a joint event with UHI Centre for History and Rural Health and Wellbeing. And welcome to those online and in Lòchran here in the new campus. I have the dull bit to say, the toilets are that way. There is no fire alarm planned. If one happens, it's real. Is there anything else, anyone? And this is being recorded. Some people who wanted to connect as a group couldn't this evening, and in case anyone else has problems, so that's a really wonderful thing, I think, for everybody. Exciting talk to come. I'll hand over to my colleague Ian Robertson from Centre for History to see how collective we are.
Thanks very much, Izzy. Thank you, and welcome everybody. It's fantastic to see such a strong audience here tonight. Actually, I didn't want to be trying to just carry on going. I've left my notes behind there. So yes, indeed, welcome, and welcome to all latecomers as well. So it's my task to very briefly introduce Professor Harper, who is here to give this wonderful talk tonight. She won't be a stranger to many of you in the room, but just in case Marjory is, she holds a chair in history at the University of Aberdeen, but also in recognition of her long-standing and very welcome and very productive relationship with the Centre for History at the University of Highlands and Islands. She also holds an honorary chair there as well. Professor Harper has published extensively on Scottish emigration, mainly to Canada, but across the 19th and 20th centuries in particular, and I'm sure many of you in the room tonight will know her work in that area. In terms of tonight's joint meeting, though, Professor Harper's most recent work of direct interest to tonight's talk is probably her paper from 2014, published in the journal Neurosciences and History. I never knew such a journal existed, to tell you the truth. But it does, and she has published in there, and has written in that august journal in 2014, as I say, on the causes of mental illness amongst Scots emigrants to Canada. Really, really interesting topic, if you ask me. Tonight, however, she casts her net a little wider to talk about the experiences of Scottish emigrants in the 20th century and beyond, under the title Strangers in a Strange Land. So, without further ado, over to Marjory. Thank you.
Just see that mic's off to join us. Sorry, 2 seconds.
Oh, yes.
It's great to see that there's, as Ian was speaking, there's a few more people joined, including folk from Canada. If all goes well, we should have several people joining from Canada this evening, or whatever time it is there. Anyone who's not used to this, please do keep your microphone off during the talk, and we'll guide everyone in joining in the questions and discussions, and obviously having your microphones on later. Okay?
Well, thank you very much, Izzy and Ian, for that introduction. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and to the people who are listening on VC. So, this is a paper of 3 largely disconnected parts, although they are linked by a rather wobbly thematic bridge. The common denominator is the dislocation that can be part and parcel of human migration. And the first part of the paper, I keep looking behind me because that's the only way I can see what's happening. The first part deals with a particularly traumatic manifestation of that dislocation, the perceived causes and consequences of mental illness among emigrants from Scotland in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The second part fast forwards chronologically to the second half of the 20th century, and it uses the personal testimony of a handful of Scottish emigrants to explore some of the specific challenges of linguistic and cultural adjustment and readjustment among 2 categories, those who settled permanently overseas and those who returned to Scotland. And the final part of the paper, if there's time, will compare very briefly the findings of those two historical periods with the experiences of recent immigrants to Scotland from a project with which I'm peripherally involved. So, you might ask legitimately, why am I weaving so many diverse and apparently disjointed strands into a single paper? And the clue lies in the phrase research projects. Because my objective this evening isn't so much to put any one historical process or event under the spotlight, as I would normally do when I'm giving an academic paper, but to outline two strands of my research, one or both of which I'm very keen to develop under the umbrella of my UHI attachment. And those two strands are migrant health in a historical and contemporary context, and secondly, the use of oral testimony to explore the migrant experience. And they're not obviously integrally related, but they can be related. My aim tonight is to give you an outline of the findings and the potential of work in progress, so that you'll be able to advise me on how we might better be able to work together. And I'll probably spend most time on the first part of the talk, so don't worry if that takes a long time. I won't keep you so long for the second part or the third. Part one. The dysfunctional diaspora question mark. More about the causes than the consequences here, I think. But I'm going to concentrate mainly on Canada, because at the empirical heart of my study of mental illness to Canada are the admission registers and the casebooks of the British Columbia Provincial Hospital for 4 decades after its establishment in 1872. And I've contextualised that basic source by using similar records from other parts of Canada, particularly from Ontario and Nova Scotia, but also using asylum registers from New Zealand and Scotland, and by a range of other sources as well, government reports, investigative commissions, medical journals, shipboard diaries, deportation records, but these are the wrong order, and emigrant correspondence. So it's mainly the hospital records, but there's a supporting cast of other sources as well. And together, here's just an example of the sources that I've been using. That's the admission register, the general admission register, obviously with the names redacted, from the TC hospital. That's the certificate of admission, statement about the particular patient, and then the very useful case histories. Every patient was given a page or two for the case record. And that's actually a letter written by the relative of somebody who was a patient in the hospital. Okay, what are the key issues? Well, I think together these sources unlock some big issues, issues that include contemporary debates about care, custody and treatment, as well as about practices of gatekeeping at port of entry and removal of people once they got in if they were deemed to be undesirable. There's also a relationship here to post-colonial discourse in which mentally marginalised migrants have been used to illustrate the colonial, quote-unquote, in other words, these people are the antithesis of authority and achievement that tend to dominate older imperial narratives. So you're getting the kind of flip side of the emigrant story. And my particular interest is in what these stories tell us by both inference and by direct statement about contemporary perceptions of the triggers for insanity among migrants. The triggers and also the consequences of a diagnosis of insanity if you were a migrant. Now, my examples are all Scots, and many of them are in fact Highlanders, but I should say right at the start that the asylum records don't indicate, don't suggest that the Scots were exceptional in any way. I could have taken similar illustrations from other ethnicities, and indeed those who didn't speak the English language had a harder mountain to climb. But we'll concentrate for a little while then on triggers. The key triggers seem to have been the pain of parting and the trauma of the journey to the new land, an alien environment, that's physically and psychologically alien, disappointed expectations, homesickness, the absence or breakdown of support networks, and the negative value judgments of the host society, which sometimes claimed, or more than sometimes, quite frequently claimed, that the migrants brought with them bad habits and hereditary illnesses, some of which their critics linked to their ethnicity. So I'd like to go on and illustrate some of these. First of all, the transition. You'll sometimes find evidence about this in ships' logs. They record cases of insanity manifesting themselves during the voyage, sometimes leading to passengers or crew throwing themselves overboard or being chained to the capstan for the duration of the voyage until, if they didn't recover in the course of the voyage, they would be then transferred to an asylum on arrival. Now, one example, not somebody who threw herself overboard and was chained to the capstan. She actually arrived in British Columbia and was confined to the hospital later. This is a Mrs. C from Edinburgh. She fell ill after she'd reached her destination, and she was admitted to the Vancouver hospital in 1890 and discharged to the care of her husband 4 years later. And according to her case notes, she had fallen ill because of the long trip from Scotland to BC. The long trip from Scotland. So you're talking there not just about transatlantic voyage, but of course the overland voyage across Canada. And she had taken opium and attempted suicide. Now, so far, Mrs. C is the only direct comment that I've found in the Canadian records about a link between the journey and insanity. But Angela McCarthy's work on the New Zealand asylum has shown, from the records there, that a bad voyage experience accounted for 8% of her sample of foreign-born patients who were admitted to Dunedin's public asylum within a year of arriving in New Zealand. That's the late 19th century. So the transition could have a negative effect. We could say a lot more about that, but we don't want to be here all night. Secondly, an alien environment. An unexpectedly challenging environment and separation from everything that was familiar could be enormously destabilising. Think, for example, again taking a Highlands instance, not from BC, this time from the prairies. Think about the crofter fishermen who found themselves on the lonely, landlocked prairie, 1,500 miles from the sea. And this is a case that was documented by the Countess of Aberdeen, who you see on the slide there, in respect of the Hebrideans who went to Killarney and Saltcoats, the two colonies that were created on the prairies in 1888, and she visited in 1890, and she talked about that alienation and that isolation. Again, thinking about New Zealand, there are a couple of cases in the Christchurch asylum records where two Scottish shepherds, not known to each other, two separate cases, were confined in the asylum because of loneliness and isolation, because they'd come from an area where they were living cheek by jowl with their neighbours and then suddenly found themselves in this completely alien, isolated landscape. So an alien environment linked and then transition of the voyage. Thirdly, you have disappointed expectations, and of course that was often linked with an alien environment. I think some of the most disappointed migrants on the planet in the 19th century must have been those who travelled the world in search for gold. And it's not surprising that we find quite a lot of them in British Columbia, the province that had lured so many people to the Cariboo in the 1860s and then to the Klondike in the 1890s. And there was a general perception among contemporaries that insanity and suicide were prevalent on the mining frontier. In other words, gold miners were expected to be deranged. Well, a handful of these mining patients who we find in the BC asylum were Scots. Donald, for example, was a bachelor from the Isle of Lewis. He was living in the Cariboo when he was admitted in 1892. So it's a long time since the Cariboo gold rush. But he was admitted in 1892 with delusions. And according to his medical certificate, quote, he thinks himself poisoned, robbed and disturbed in his work, hears voices around his cabin, unquote. And then if we pick up the gold mining theme from another set of records much closer to home, this is the Inverness District Asylum records, we find back in 1866 the admission of 33-year-old M, whose previous occupation was gold mining in Ballarat, Australia. He was diagnosed with melancholia, depression, of 2 years' duration, and his case notes refer to his delusion of possessing, quote, a whole goldfield in Australia, unquote. as well as the information that his brother was in an asylum in Musselburgh. And that's an important point we can come back to later. Now, 2 years later, M was discharged to the care of his friends. Interestingly, not because he was cured, but it said in the record, for want of accommodation here. So the Inverness hospital didn't have room to keep him any longer. So, disappointed expectations often linked to an alien environment. And then we have homesickness. Now, of course, as you'll have realised, none of these factors operates unilaterally. An alien environment or disappointed expectations could trigger or exacerbate an existing condition and could exacerbate homesickness. And in some extreme cases, homesickness could lead to mental breakdown. And it wasn't mentioned, that term wasn't used as a cause in any of the medical registers, in any of the register entries, but it can be deduced from some of the case notes. And as you saw when I was flicking through those examples from the records that I photographed from the BC asylum, you saw a letter from a relative. And some of the clues in that British Columbian context come from family correspondence rather than from the patients themselves or from medical assessment. And I'll just give you one example here. And it's from Charles, who came from Leith. Charles was admitted to the BC asylum in 1902, and he died there 16 years later. And an undated letter from his sister that was received by the asylum during the First World War contained this poignant comment. It's undated, but it's during the war. She wrote, "It is very heartbreaking, his constant desire to get home, where there is no home. If we could manage to pay his fare, would it be possible to get him transferred to any institution here, where we could at least see him? I would come out and see him if I could." Unquote. So there you have a different take on the pain of parting. It's the pain of being apart in the part of that sister where she's thousands of miles from her brother who's been committed to the hospital. There's another issue that, like homesickness, isn't mentioned in the official record, but which emerges implicitly from the case histories. And this is whether some individuals were predisposed to mental illness simply because they were chronic migrants, rather than through any specific consequence of their migration. Now, that's obviously a chicken and egg question, which is impossible to answer. And of course, migration wasn't normally a consequence of dysfunctionality, because rootlessness didn't cause insanity. And on the contrary, the emphasis was that constant mobility was a positive reflection of people being able to take up the opportunities of the international labour market. But if you look at the records, you find that one of the most striking features that emerges, at least from these BC case histories, is the extraordinary and sustained itinerancy among many patients prior to their admission. Now, I'm aware there are lots of holes in this argument, and I can address those later if you wish. But some of the cases that are documented, you find people who had been rolling stones since childhood. Several of them had lost touch completely with their parents and siblings, perhaps because they wanted to, perhaps inadvertently. And perhaps there was a sense among some of those who moved ever westwards of escalating hopelessness until they reached the end of the line at the Pacific. So what did you do when you got to the Pacific coast and you still hadn't found your pot of gold, perhaps literally, at the end of the rainbow? Where did you go next if it didn't work out there? For one example, James, born and brought up in West Sutherland, he came to Canada with his parents at the age of 15, and he worked in about 10 places across the States and Canada, often, like many patients, actually for the railways in railway construction. And another case of a chaotic and unsettled lifestyle is an Aberdeen granite mason who was an alcoholic who'd spent 19 years, according to the hospital records, wandering around the various states of the US, from the east to the west coast, until he eventually ended up in the Vancouver hospital in 1911. But that's a rather speculative trigger, I think, predisposition. I think we're on slightly firmer ground here with the absence or breakdown of support networks, because often going hand in hand with constant movement were solitude and the absence or breakdown of family and community supports. I've already mentioned solitude in the context of an alien environment and isolated working conditions. And again, we're talking about a chicken and egg question. The absence of support mechanisms and solitude could trigger mental breakdown, but they could also exacerbate its consequences. Another factor maybe to think about here is the gendered element, because the absence of an effective support network didn't just affect rolling stones or isolated prospectors, single prospectors working their gold claims up lonely creeks in the Yukon. There is a gendered element. Married women who suffered desertion or family breakdown, domestic violence, postnatal depression or bereavement were perhaps particularly vulnerable to dysfunctional or absent support networks. And many of them found themselves left at home for long periods as their husbands engaged in multiple occupations, logging, cannery work, mining, whatever it might be. But I also found a disturbing subtext in some of the entries in the BC records, records that hint at domestic abuse. Just one example. Jean from Nairn was admitted in 1910, and her admission record stated that the cause was, quote, abuse by drunken husband and hard times, unquote. And that was compounded by childbirth. I might mention Jean later because it's a rather disturbing consequence to that as well. And then, finally, as a trigger, we have the negative value judgments of host societies, not least the medical establishment within the host society. A recurring concern in medical circles was heredity. The subtext being there that the donor country was exporting its insane. And when patients were admitted to hospital, the first thing that the clerk did was to record their family histories. And questions about hereditary insanity headed the list in the admission questionnaire. So very often it wasn't answered because the patient wasn't in a fit state to answer. Anyway, the question asked about hereditary insanity. The questionnaire also asked about what were called bad habits, and specifically bad habits meant alcohol abuse and venereal disease. Now again, of course, there are ambiguities here, and these ambiguities are very well illustrated, I think, in the case of one particular individual, James from Shetland. He has an entry in the asylum register in 1899 that states he was a man of, quote, no occupation, unquote, whose illness had been caused by inebriety. But unusually and very fortuitously, we have some corroborative evidence on James. Most of these guys that we see in the records, we don't know anything more about them. There might be some supportive correspondence in the hospital records, but we've got some independent evidence about James, because in the Shetland archives, we have a letter that James wrote to his mother in 1891, a year after he had arrived in Vancouver and some years before he was admitted to the hospital. And in that letter, he wrote briefly of the misleading propaganda that he said had lured him to a city where there was high unemployment and high living costs, but low wages, and where, despite having some training in medicine, he had been forced to take part in a series of, resort to a succession of menial jobs which kept him barely above the breadline. And his last cent had gone on posting this tale of woe to his mother. But he didn't want the news of his failure to spread too far, because he wrote, "Had I better news to convey, it would have been different. But the outlook is so dark that it is better to keep it to yourselves." Unquote. So you have a bit more of an insight into James there, don't you? And you can say, well, was his tale of woe a consequence of alcoholism? Or did he hit the bottle because of the circumstances that he found himself in once he was in Vancouver? We just don't know. So medical diagnoses clearly involved value judgments, which can also be inferred from the language that was used to describe patients. Again, an illustration from the BC hospital files. Hugh from Glasgow was admitted in 1910. His father had died in an asylum in Ireland, so he ticked that box of hereditary insanity from the point of view of the authorities. A paternal uncle was also in an asylum in Ireland as a result of what was listed as excessive drinking. And Hugh himself had been convicted of drunkenness and vagrancy. And his case notes, in describing his delusional trends, recorded that he had, quote, no fixed delusions except those usually found in a degenerate, unquote. And in answer to the question of whether he was dangerous to others, the doctor wrote, "Not more so than others of his class." So you get the picture. And then, finally, ethnicity. Value judgments could also involve race and ethnicity. To date, in the research that's been done, this is more evident in the New Zealand records than it is in the Canadian ones, not least in attitudes to Highlanders. And sometimes the comments came from the migrants themselves. And I'll give you one example. Daniel was a 77-year-old farmer from Invercargill, but he was a native of Perthshire, and he'd been in New Zealand for 48 years when he was admitted to an asylum in Dunedin in 1897. And I'm drawing on Angela McCarthy's work here. His medical report read, quote, "He is a typical high-spirited old Highlander, and when taxed with being too lively, he," that is the patient, "says, 'Too much Highland blood in me,'" unquote. And the case notes also flagged up linguistic markers. Again, in the Dunedin records, a native of Campbelltown, a patient in the hospital in Dunedin, was described as, quote, "continuously talking, sometimes Gaelic, sometimes senseless English," unquote. And another one apparently did nothing but curse in Gaelic. But as I say, there's much less evidence of this in the Canadian records. I found my only allusion was in respect to a man called Kenneth, who was admitted to the hospital in Vancouver from Nelson, which is in about 250 miles east in BC. He was admitted in 1907, and his case notes said, "He talks and shrieks in Gaelic continuously, will not answer any questions, nor talk in English, merely yells in Gaelic," unquote. I think it's surprising that that's the only evidence I've found where ethnicity and linguistic differences are clearly linked to illness, because in the decade before the First World War, Canada was obsessed with eugenics, a eugenics-dominated debate really particularly about migrants, particularly about English migrants. And Canadians were preoccupied with the idea that weak-minded immigrants from Britain were polluting their society and draining their economy. Now, perhaps it's because I was looking at Scots that I didn't find quite so much evidence of that, but certainly in that decade before the First World War, there was a lot of eugenics-driven debate. We jump ahead to 1923, you do find an example of anti-Scottish or anti-Highland sentiment. It's a letter that was written to the Canadian Immigration Department from an individual in Toronto. And this individual was complaining about the recent influx of Hebrideans to the prairies, part of Andrew MacDonnell's scheme, if that means anything to you. And the correspondent complained on the grounds that their predecessors who'd gone from the Highlands to Nova Scotia 100 years earlier had sown the seeds of generations of ne'er-do-wells. He intoned in his letter, "Go to the island of Cape Breton, and you will see men of fine physique, no doubt, but living in poverty and content to do so. Their asylums are crowded. They are absolutely unreliable citizens, and not to be compared with lowland Scots, who are thrifty," unquote. So there you see the prejudice wasn't against Scots per se, it's against Highlanders. That's what happened to the BC Hospital in 2007. It's amazing how many of these institutions do actually get torched. A lot of them end up in that state. There isn't really time to deal with the consequences of the diagnoses, but I just want to mention this dimension briefly, not least because it is underexplored and I think it has potential for future research. To sum up, the responses were both provincial and federal. In provincial terms, there was pragmatism demonstrated in custodial confinement, which was initially in jails and then in special hospitals, and also you get community care and you get repatriation. Committals to the asylum could be made, or to the jail initially and then to the asylum, could be made by a number of individuals, JPs, prison governors, magistrates and families. Now, some families saw the asylum as a place to dump unwanted relatives. Others saw the asylum as a kind of medical pawn shop where they deposited and sometimes collected, again, their relatives as financial or other circumstances dictated. But in other cases, they were definitely a last resort when families could no longer cope at home. You find that men were usually admitted for dangerous behaviour, violent behaviour. Women, it was when they could no longer cope with what was seen as their domestic duties. So there is a sort of gender difference there. And some migrants who had no support mechanisms had no option but to end up in the asylum. If the insane migrant had relatives back in the old country, in Britain, then the asylum encouraged repatriation for reasons of cost. So that was the provincial scenario: custodial care, community care, and repatriation possible. But there was a federal overlay to this provincial scenario. If the practical care of insane migrants was a provincial responsibility, then the development of policy lay with the federal government. And by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it was a policy that was influenced very much by eugenics and the sort of value judgments that I've just been talking about. While it involved an element of gatekeeping at ports of departure and entry through screening and through quarantine, more emphasis was put on subsequent firefighting through deportation. But imagine the trauma if you've got to the port of entry and then you're told, well, somebody in the family can come in, but no, your child's got such and such a disease and it's got to be sent home again. And what do you do in those sort of circumstances? Anyway, deportation. Canada deported far more immigrants than any other of the British dominions. The objective was financial, very clearly. It was to get rid of individuals who were or were likely to become public charges. And insanity was, from the very start, right at the centre of that definition. Responsibility for bringing the individuals back safely, and sometimes indeed for delivering them straight to an asylum in Scotland, generally fell on the steamship companies that had brought them out. Now, we don't know much about individual deportees for reasons that I can explain later, except when things went wrong. As in 1908, and again, it's one Highland example, 22-year-old Thomas, who came from Tain, was deported about 3 months after he arrived in Canada and was admitted to the hospital in Vancouver. Now, in the middle of the St. Lawrence River, he broke away from his attendant, jumped overboard and was drowned. And his father in Tain subsequently sued the Allen Line for not keeping a proper suicide watch, not least because the deportation order made it very clear that Thomas was insane and had in fact shown signs of insanity before he had ever left Scotland. And I do think there's scope for doing a lot more work in a comparative context, not just Canada, but other parts of the so-called British world and beyond, on the denial of entry and deportation. So that's part one, and I said I wouldn't keep you so long with part two, but I want to move on to something different, the second theme, which introduces a new period and a new methodology. But just before we do that, that's a deportation order, and that's a letter about deportation. I'll just tell you now what the reason why I can't actually do much on deportation is that the Canadian archives, in their wisdom, decided in, I think, the 1940s that they would destroy all the nominal deportation records because nobody would ever want to look at them. So we can't actually, unless there was an unusual case, there is no paper trail. Okay, part two then. The second theme, as I say, introduces a new period and a different methodology. While there's certainly not a clear thematic link, some of the experiences articulated in what follows do indicate the challenges of adjustment, or perhaps more pertinently, how emigrants navigated those challenges. In constructing whole life stories with interviewees, the range of topics is obviously vast, but it always includes an exploration of identity-related issues. Whether and how people adapted or integrated or assimilated into their new environments, or indeed whether they felt alienated from those environments. And what I want to do now is dip into a few of their reflections. And my challenge was which audio clips to use from really an embarrassment of riches, as interviewees spoke about issues surrounding language and dialect, schooling, social life, politics, a whole range of things. And I've pared the audio clips down hugely, and I'll actually summarise much of what was said. I mean, the whole point of... I was in two minds when I was preparing this lecture, because I could have done it as an example of how oral methodology works, because here's the commercial plug here. I've got a book coming out next month that's based on about 100 interviews that I've done. And I would dearly like to spend, an hour playing you the clips, because the intonation of the voice does actually make a difference. But if I were to do that, then you would be here all night. So I'm going to play about 3 clips, and I'll just speak over the others. There is no point in giving a paper about oral testimony if you don't actually hear some of the testimony. So I will let some of the emigrants speak for themselves. Well, first of all, language and dialect. I'm not going to let Morag speak. Poor Morag. Anyway, she was a brilliant interviewee. Among all my interviewees, a determination to blend in linguistically was a recurring thread in the testimony of those who emigrated as children. Children do not like to be different. Back in the 1920s, on the Canadian prairies, Morag McLeod, as she was then, and Morag Bennett later, age 95 when that was taken, deliberately jettisoned her first language of Gaelic. She said, we didn't think much of it. But she wanted to be no different from those around her. More than 40 years later, Alan Blair, of whom I don't have a photo, Alan emigrated from Lanarkshire to Ontario at the age of 12 in 1968, I think it was. And he explained that altering his speech was a deliberate and key part of his strategy for assimilating to his new life. And I'll just quote him. He said, "It wasn't that I was maltreated or mistreated, but I didn't like being the centre of attention, and I was certainly the centre of attention for the first part of that school year. So probably by Christmas I was a proper little Canadian and indistinguishable from the Canadians on either side of me." And in very similar vein, Helen Bowie, who's pictured in the middle there, spoke of a similar embarrassment in standing out from the crowd when she was taken by her mother to Australia. Her mother had been widowed and moved out to Australia. I think it was in the same year as Alan Blair went to Canada. And she was also 12 years old. And perhaps her problem in adjustment wasn't helped because on her first day at school, she turned up wearing the uniform of the school that she had just left in Irvine. She said her grandmother then went and bought her the right uniform, so all was well. But she said she didn't actually realise she had a Scottish accent until she was teased about it. And then here we have Brian Coots, who also emigrated as a child to New Zealand in 1955. And he maintained a dual linguistic identity for many years, not least because of his father's lifelong anger at having taken the family to New Zealand. The father did not integrate well. And I might let Brian speak for himself. Actually, I don't know if I can, but maybe I can, yes. So I can speak. Oops, no. Most of them are going to play automatic.
I got quite a hard time about having a Scottish accent, and so I lost that in public very quickly. I retained it for being at home, because it was either being teased at home or being teased at school, so I decided I didn't like either, so I picked up a New Zealand accent as quickly as possible for school, and I spoke to my parents with a Scottish accent. In fact, the last of that disappeared when my father died.
Not much trace of the Scottish accent there now. The peer pressure and the memory of being ridiculed was also evident in reverse. Here we have a brother and sister, the late Callum and Cathy Murray, who returned to the Isle of Lewis in 1933, 6 years after going to Canada. They had to slot back into a small Aberdeen school. And Callum said in his interview, he said, "I didn't find it very easy for a start." And he recalled his teacher disputing his pronunciation of the capital of Saskatchewan. "It's not Regina, it's Regina. Don't come here with your Canadian accent," the teacher said. His younger sister, Cathy, remembers being the object of curiosity and ridicule from fellow pupils and teachers alike. So, the situation, the ridicule worked both ways, for emigrants going out and for people coming back. And then 3 decades later, Christine, you get a prize if you can tell where that is. I'll leave it there. Anyway, 3 decades later, Christine Matheson came back from New Zealand to the Highlands, where her father had been teaching. This is in 1962. The family had spent 3 years out there. Her schooling in New Zealand had been, she said, far more relaxed and enjoyable than what she was to encounter in her homeland. In New Zealand, she told me, it wasn't learning through fear. I can't remember anybody getting punished for not being able to do something. Re-entry into the Scottish system, she recalled, was a terrible, terrible experience. She repeated the terrible. And it included teachers ridiculing the alleged backwardness of her and her brother in front of a colleague. I won't play this one, I'll just pick out a little bit from it. You'll see, you can read it on the screen yourself. She says, we went to Cromarty School and it was the biggest culture shock we ever had. The children were chanting the tables backwards and forwards. They were very good at mental arithmetic. Every day they had to learn bits of the Bible, a paraphrase or a psalm. The minister would come in to catechize them. This was just totally new. The teacher was ferocious and she used the strap very liberally. She punished children if they couldn't do something. We were terrified of her. We thought there must be a mistake here. She's not young and glamorous like teachers should be. I barely opened my mouth. I remember she ranted and raved about how backward we were, and she gave us special homework. So not a terribly happy experience for Christine. We'll let some others speak for themselves in a minute. I was fortunate to have among my interviewees a professor of linguistics, this chap here, Graham McGregor. He emigrated from Scotland to Dunedin in 1989, and he was able to blend professional theory with personal experience in explaining the reasons for retention or loss of accent. He actually retained his Scottish accent. He had a finely tuned ear, and he admitted when he came to New Zealand that he did miss the voices. But his view is that it's a deliberate decision, and he says it's what's called in the profession divergence or convergence. It's a deliberate decision to converge or diverge linguistically. And he illustrated this from his own experience when he was being interviewed for a lecturing post while he was still in the UK, and having been told that if he got the job, he would be expected to adopt received pronunciation. He reacted by emphasising his distinctiveness in a similar way to some emigrants who felt that their identity was being threatened or undermined by being required to adopt a new accent. And he said, so what I did in that situation was not convergence, as it's called in linguistics, but divergence. And I found myself getting further and further away from that particular way of speaking to a much more Scottish voice, to say maximally, hey mate, I'm not actually like you, I'm different. I have a different history, I have a different culture, I have a different ethnicity, I have a different musicology, I have a different sense of education, I have a different religious upbringing, I have a different past, I have a different history, and I remember it, and we're not the same. Graham also explained in the course of a fascinating interview that language can also function in a more complex way than simply as a mechanism for assimilation or distinctiveness. It can be, I think this is a pretty self-evident point, it can be a vehicle for establishing networks and a verbal means of conveying an identity that might be expressed through things like clothing or food or what's the buzzword is association or culture, but it is also something that can be done through language. Okay, we'll move on. So far, all the destinations we've been looking at have been English-speaking, but what about places where the emigrants were faced with a new language? This is Ken Morrison. He was born in Hong Kong in 1951. His father, like many Scots, had joined the Hong Kong police force in 1946. His father had never been out of Scotland, but he assimilated with enthusiasm. He became very fluent in Chinese, and he ultimately became a very high-ranking police officer in charge of the new territories. And his enthusiasm was passed on to Ken, who returned to Hong Kong after he'd been at university in Scotland, and he married Isabel, who is of Cantonese, Portuguese and Scottish ancestry. An interesting mix there. Ken developed a successful accountancy business, which he still runs. And in his interview, Ken pondered whether Hong Kong's more recent Scottish arrivals have been less willing to commit themselves to the local community, linguistically and otherwise. And he said, well, while his Scottish identity was important to him, he said it wasn't his only identity. He said, because there's lots of other things that are precious as well. And he went on to say, But I do think, among the Scots, for those that do hang together, it might be a limiting factor to them integrating more into the community. They don't speak any Chinese, nor do they want to. And if it became difficult here, they'd be off. In other words, there's not the sense of commitment. And I'll play a clip that, again, from that part of the world that illustrates a related point. Cameron and Ishbel Talloch are both doctors, graduates of the University of Aberdeen, both from the Highlands. After graduating from Aberdeen University, they went out to the Far East, initially to Taiwan and then to Hong Kong. And they spent 30 years running a clinic out there. They're back in the sky now. And Cameron reflected about why his wife found it easier than he did to learn the language. He reckoned it was because she was already bilingual and Gaelic was her first language. And Cameron speculated that because he was monolingual, language study was more challenging, and he felt that he resisted, and perhaps resisted subconsciously, the adaptation that was required not to keep thinking in English. And perhaps because of that language barrier, because he found it difficult to learn the language, he also initially found it quite difficult to adjust culturally. And the breakthrough came when he attended a Mandarin language church service, which brought him into cultural affinity with those with whom he couldn't yet share a language itself. So we'll hear him, I hope.
Bill was more excited about being in a new place and finding out about it than I was. I think I had a fairly significant cultural shock for 9 months. And the thing that relieved me of that was going to worship in a Chinese church. 9 months after we got there, we decided we should go to a Mandarin service. And I wasn't understanding a lot of it, obviously, at that stage, but we were singing hymns that I was familiar with. And it just suddenly came over me that here we were in Taiwan with all these people that we didn't know, Chinese people, worshipping the same God that we had worshipped back in Scotland. And the sense of strangeness, which was a significant part of this cultural shock, is lifted. And I felt at home, and I did from then on. So we were settled from that point on.
So for Cameron, it was his shared Christian faith with the Taiwanese that was the key factor and the crucial point for integration. Here we have Bill and Elizabeth Graham, who spent 20 years in South Africa from 1976 to 1996. And they said that despite the obvious environmental differences and the problems of living under the apartheid regime, they said it was easy to feel at home, partly because of the welcome that they received from the host society, but also because some of the things that they encountered reminded them very much of their childhoods in Sutherland and Caithness, respectively. Elizabeth explained, I'll just quote her, "We felt as if we had gone back to our youth because there were general stores with paraffin lamps, and we found the people were so like the Sutherland people. We had a real rapport with the country people because we came from country places, and the people were just the same, and we felt completely at home with them, and the shops were still selling stuff they had when we were little," unquote. So they felt at home because of that sense of familiarity with Sutherland and Caithness. Now, for others it was more difficult, and these are my final quotes that are coming up. Alice Moffat and her husband emigrated from Fife to Australia in the 1960s. They settled down very happily and they cultivated a community of Fifers down under. But as Alice explains, she was never able to get her head around celebrating Christmas and New Year in a hot climate. And it's those celebrations that always trigger a homesickness that she does not experience otherwise. And her first Christmas was a particular disaster, as we will hear.
First Christmas, because we got there in November, and the first Christmas, it was terrible. We got some friends to come over to the flat, because we were in a flat. So, of course, I'm doing everything that you do in Scotland and England, you know. Roast potatoes, mince pies, you know, all the trimmings, Christmas dinner. Nobody could eat it. It was too hot. And that was pretty upsetting. But I'll tell you something, even after all these years in Australia, I still don't like Christmas. It's not the same. You know, it's too hot.
I should say that Alice did not have hiccups. That interview was conducted on Skype, and something went wrong with Skype, so that my end was just, and I didn't have hiccups either. But I'm sorry about that. There's not a lot can be done about it. But there's just one very short clip when Alice goes on to talk about New Year.
And to this day, I still get homesick at New Year. Especially when you watch the tattoo and things like that. Yes, still play the Scottish music, but the thing is now, all the grandkids are there now, you know what I mean? But I've got Scottish friends that said, oh, I don't think about Scotland, you know, no. But I do. My husband and I both do.
Okay, and she hasn't lost her accent, despite all those years. One final example, which I won't play the clip, but it demonstrates cultural adjustment in reverse. And I'm just including it because I think it's quite fun. It's a case of someone who returned to Scotland after spending a childhood in Africa. And this is Brian Stewart, pictures of his late mother here. He was only 3 when his father got a job as a forester in the Southern Rhodesian Forestry Service, so it's now Zimbabwe. And when he was growing up in Rhodesia, he said he had a curious sort of pride in his Scottish roots, but without any sense that Scotland was home. On the contrary, he said, moving back to Morayshire in his teens in 1964, because his father had taken ill, involved considerable culture shock. And he talked about what he said was his Crocodile Dundee moment, when having suddenly been transplanted from the remote bush of Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia, to Selfridges in London, he was confronted by an escalator, something he had never seen before. So this was his Crocodile Dundee moment. He said he was also confronted with a strange piece of clothing called an anorak, which he described as a straitjacket. And to quote Brian, I'd never seen anything like this in my life, and the idea that I was going to have to wear this strange piece of kit in order to put up with the Scottish climate was a bit daunting, unquote. Brian went on to be British ambassador in Algeria towards the end of his career, so he obviously got the wanderlust bug, and I think Hazel knows Brian. Okay, finally, this is the end, I promise. If I conclude briefly with the big so what question, what does all this, how does all this relate to issues facing current migrants in Scotland? And that brings me to the SAMIS project, just to mention it briefly. That's the Social Support and Migration in Scotland project, which has involved, amongst other things, interviews with Central and Eastern European migrants who've come into Scotland since 2004. And the project directors kindly gave me access to their findings and indeed their interviews. And in the testimony of some of these recent migrants to Scotland, and David knows more about this than I do, I found clear echoes of the attitudes and the concerns and the experiences of earlier generations of migrants in other locations. And I just listed them there by bullet point. To summarise, a recurring theme across time and place has been loneliness, and connected to being in an alien culture with a lack of support networks. And that was said in a lot of these SAMIS interviews as well. Secondly, loneliness and alien culture. Social isolation was sometimes compounded by linguistic differences, difficulties. And to quote one Polish interviewee in that project, she said, I just wasn't capable of having a conversation with anyone, unquote. So you can import some of the issues I've been looking at in the past very much into the present. And that isolation sometimes led to an introspection that impeded integration. People would close in and just talk to each other within their own communities. And again, I can see parallels with what I was looking at in the 1920s and in the 19th century with the Hebrideans in Alberta and the Hebrideans on the prairies, the 1888 settlement. The key continuity between the past and the present, particularly in health and education, seemed to be the disparity between expectations and experiences. Now, it's 7 o'clock, so I'm not going to go into that in any more detail at all, but I can unpack it a bit if you want me to. But the general point is that there are clear parallels which, in an era of ongoing immigration, seem to me to be worth exploring, as well as some of the issues that are raised in the more historical part of the paper, which I think have also potential for further development and comparative work that takes us across the globe. But I'll leave it there. I have a number of points for discussion if you're interested, but I think we shall, there's a discussion points. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Marjory, for a really stimulating and most interesting paper. There's time for questions. In a moment, we'll open it up to the folks coming in from elsewhere, but just to give them a chance to have a think about their questions, I'll open it up to the floor here at the moment, if that's okay with you. Yeah, okay, so opportunity for questions. David first.
I'm very interested in the points around Gaelic speakers' propensity to pick up other languages, and it's something I was exploring. I've got absolutely very little evidence for in a completely different period. I've been looking at the memoirs, I don't know if you know, Marjorie, of a minister called James Fraser, who was a Gaelic speaker who travelled in Europe in the 1650s. And much more than any other travel account I know from that period, he collects phrases, terms in lesser known languages. He doesn't just rely on German when he's in Central Europe, he tries to pick up Hungarian and Czech. And when I compare that with other travel accounts at the same time, there's much more of that. And he has this particular interest in linguistics, which is true, and that's reflected in his later life. So I wondered if you had a sense of that as something they were aware of, or was it generally subliminal, subconscious almost, that they were picking it up?
My main source for that sort of issue is what Cameron Tallow said about his perception of his wife's ability to pick up Mandarin much more easily than he could. And it's not something that Gaelic-speaking immigrants, other Gaelic-speaking immigrants whom I've interviewed, actually talked about, or whose facility with other languages was mentioned by commentators. But I was very interested in what Cameron Tallow said, because he said, well, his wife had an ear, or has an ear, that is more attuned to other languages because she had to learn English. It was not the default language. And I think those of us who are native English speakers are very lazy. And I think it comes back to that, really. But it's really just, he said that at times it made him, very occasionally, it made him feel resentful. He said a BBC Alba crew went out to Hong Kong one year to do a feature on Gaelic speakers in Hong Kong. And of course they were speaking to Ishmael in Gaelic, and he said he felt left out. But his observation was that she had picked up Mandarin much more quickly because from her early days she had been aware of language issues. And I think that's probably the case of, going back to your...
Yes, it's the same for him. He knew 4 or 5 languages by the time he was a teenager. And I think he was just used to living and working in a multilingual environment.
I think that's a really interesting parallel across the centuries. That's fascinating.
Any other questions? I'm sure there must be.
Marjorie, do you feel that the language is a huge part of adjusting to another country? Being able to, there's obviously a lot of other issues, but language, if you're not able to integrate linguistically, does that cause huge problems for people? Or do you think it's just a way of holding back to their own homeland almost?
I think it depends what the circles in which people move and the jobs that they do. So that, you're taking the Hong Kong example, Ken Morrison's father made a very deliberate effort to learn the language, and as a result of that, he was not only promoted to high rank within the police force, he was very well respected within the Hong Kong police force. And to this day, the police cars in Hong Kong are prefixed with AM. Alexander Morrison was, a tribute to him. His son said that, I think I maybe quoted it, that nowadays people are less likely, less willing to put in the effort to learn Mandarin or Cantonese, and tend to rely on their own networks. So they would, many of the people in Hong Kong, of course, are in business and finance and the kind of work where they don't actually need the language. They haven't done that until recently. But the St Andrews Society of Hong Kong is a very vibrant St Andrews Society, and I think possibly more so than some of the ones in English-speaking locations where Scots have settled or sojourned. But I think it also depends on whether people went out with the intention to settle or to sojourn. And if the attitude was one, well, I'm here to make a fast buck or to do my stint and then come back, then there was less incentive to learn the language. Going back to those Hebrideans on the prairies in the 1880s, many of them were monolingual Gaelic speakers. And about 10 years, they didn't do terribly well in the settlements. About 10 years on, the local merchant who was supplying them with seed corn made this very interesting comment in a report, and he said, Gaelic may be a very nice and expressive, what he called it, expressive dialect, but you cannot grow wheat from it, and these people had nothing else. And the subtext there was that they were not willing to look beyond their little colony to, for example, ask advice from their Russian neighbours who had come from the steppes and knew the techniques that were applicable also to prairie farming, and that they might have done better economically if they had mixed a bit more. But that's not necessarily the fault of the Hebrideans, because many of the settlements on the prairies at that time were very ethnically exclusive. So I think that the sojourning and settlement made a big, depending which it was, made a big difference. Thank you.
Is it?
You mentioned in the 19th century documents about the use of the word melancholia for depression, but the word homesickness is more current. Did you catch in that any use of the word nostalgia, which used to be used in Svetlana Boyd's lovely book in The Future of Nostalgia mentions that lots of things, used to be used particularly about Scots and Swiss and longing for mountain areas and needing soup, blah, 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 is the sort of discourse around it as a substitute for a sense of that, or is it just culturally a different discussion?
It wasn't used as a medical term at that time, if I remember rightly. Trying to think when the terminology changed, but nostalgia would not have been a diagnosis. It might have come into the writing up of case notes. This person is nostalgic.
Yeah.
But even then, it wasn't a term that I recall seeing very frequently. But yeah, it's interesting how the terminology does change.
Okay, I think we'll give folks out in VC land, as we tend to call them, that's an opportunity to ask a question now. So if there's anybody out there, please now is your opportunity to press your microphone on and speak. Okay, we'll assume that there are no questions elsewhere. So we're moving towards the kind of wrapping things up. But any opportunity, there's an opportunity now for any last questions. If anybody has anything really pressing, I'm sure Marjory will hang around afterwards anyway to chat. But any final questions? I have one final question. Izzy has another one. Anybody else?
The Rockfield people in
yes,
Open.
Hang on, you need to press your microphone on, I think. What should
Hello, can you hear us?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, good, fantastic. Okay, Val has a question. Oh, where have you gone? Oh, dear. Can't see you, but you can hear us. So here, I don't think. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. Okay. Well, what I was wondering was, with all this information, how can you collate it to help the people who are coming as migrants
to Scotland, particularly all these people who are coming from, war-torn places where they're going to have all sorts of other awful things to cope with, as well as homesickness and alienation and all the rest of it. So how can that be moved forward?
Okay, it's a challenging question, and it was something that challenged. Look at this. Something that challenged me when I was invited in September to go to a World Health Organization symposium in Copenhagen to talk about these very issues about refugees, asylum seekers, and economic migrants. And I felt that I was there in a kind of fraudulent capacity because I was a historian, and they were looking at the real issues of how do you deal with the trauma of crossing the Mediterranean and so many lives lost, and the trauma of living in refugee camps. And what the organiser said was, no, we need to know what happened in the past so that we can understand the issues of the present. And I don't have a direct answer to your question, but I think one of the lessons, or some of the lessons we can learn from the past, is by looking at what went wrong and why it went wrong, and then try to apply the lessons of past mistakes. And back in May, I was at a conference organised by the school teachers in Stirling, and that was to do with how to help asylum seekers and in schools, the children and also their parents become integrated into Scottish society. And that what I was focusing on there was some of these linguistic issues where my examples of people from the mid-20th century and a bit earlier were people who had been ridiculed for their difference. And you can legislate all you like, but attitudes are much harder to change than laws. And it's when you have examples in people's own words of what happened to them, that example can sometimes embed itself into people's minds in a way that reading a piece of legislation that says you must not do this wouldn't. So although I felt my part was very peripheral, I don't think it was completely wasted. So that would be my take on it as a historian. We collect and we analyse and we evaluate evidence from the past and see how we can hopefully learn from our mistakes.
I'm sure you're absolutely right, Marjory. It is about, isn't it, allowing people to have their voice and sharing their voice and that memory into kind of the collective memory, I suppose. The challenge then becomes how you allow local folks to access those voices, those memories, in what ways you can facilitate that. And I guess that might be one way in which you can take some of this stuff forward is think about bringing it into the public realm. Stuff like you've had great experience with, Izzy, really.
Is that a DG segue to ask about other questions?
Yes, it was, yes.
I think my other question might in fact be another project or something I don't know, but when you talked about conversions and diversions in terms of accent and how people were using that, what that meant, and then bi and multilingualism, from a mental health point of view, of course, with at certain stages of dementia, people can end up speaking a language of childhood and have no one around them that speaks that language, and that's a big problem now and will be a problem in the future. And I just wondered if anything came out of the interviewing or indeed the records that implied that. When you said about the gentleman, where was it, that was yelling in Gaelic, I actually wondered in that record, because there's the distress and confusion, and there's a whole job to do in understanding some of those signals in a multilingual sort of a way, which also speaks then to traumatic migrations as well as other sorts and itinerants.
Yeah, and you're right, there's a whole other project there.
Is it? Sorry, right.
I think, no, it's fine, I'm looking for the projects. But with the migrants, of course, with issues like dementia, if people are reverting to memories of a childhood or an early adulthood in a totally different place, they can't reconstruct that environment. My elderly interviewees, people like Morag, who's in her 90s, had been in Canada, in her case, for so long that it was kind of irrelevant. I mean, she didn't have dementia anyway, but her whole life was built around her Canadian experience, and actually what she said was, I went back to Benbecula once 12 years ago, have you ever been there? There's nothing there, is there? That's the quote. So it's another, it's a totally, it is another project, but very, very relevant. I don't know about the man from Nelson, whether, I can't remember, I could look up to see what his age was, but I don't know if it was dementia related or not. They would not have, yes, there would have been there was a term that they used, but I don't think, it wasn't senility, it was an old-fashioned term for something that we would now call dementia. But yes, I'm looking for, to go back to the question from Oban, I'm looking at how we can import some of this historical material into current situations, not least to do with immigration into Scotland, and how we might develop a project that will draw on what's already been done historically, build on that to create more of a historical base, but then use that to inform current policy and practice and further research. So I think that's on some of those bullet points, yeah. Current portfolio and future plans. Yes, there is contemporary relevance. Hoping that the Wellcome Trust might fund something in the long term. The oral testimony. And I've had this collaboration with SAMIS, but I've also got a collaboration with one of the people who was one of the directors of the SAMIS project, a geographer called Sergei Shubin, who's at Swansea University. And he and I are working together on a project that looks at faith and migration and the importance of religious faith, as you saw in Cameron Tallep's extract. So Sergei and I are approaching that from very different angles. Sergei's very much a conceptual human geographer and I'm an empiricist, so sometimes we find it interesting to chat. But we're working on that, and we gave a joint paper in Edinburgh a couple of months ago. So that's ongoing. The penultimate bullet point there is that I've just been asked to get involved with a project that the National Library of Australia is running from 2018 to 2021, which is an oral history of Scots in Australia, and I'm hoping that I might be able to do that with a UHI involvement. And the other thing is that there is a book. Can you do a commercial?
Go carry on.
Migration and mental health.
Selling T-shirts outside.
So, exactly. Linking the past and the present. I did edit this book last year, which involves historians, geographers, a theologian, an anthropologist, a social worker, and a psychiatrist. So the contributors to that book are from a range of disciplines. So we are trying to make it a project that is multidisciplinary. End of commercial.
Thank you very much. Any other final questions? Okay, no, thank you very much for your participation. Thank you very much, Marjory. And it just remains for me to thank Izzy as my co-chair and to draw the evening to a close with traditional thank you to Marjory again. Thank you. And thank you very much also to the people who joined us online. That was great. I hope you got plenty from it. When you leave us, can I just ask you to ensure that you end the recording or your session from your end, or else it will record for the rest of the evening. And we really don't want that. So if you wouldn't mind ensuring that, that's great. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
This call has been disconnected. Thank you for joining.